Hello, welcome to another video. In this video, we're going to look at how we can build a workflow editor using a library called jsPlumb. So the workflow editor that we're going to build looks something like what you see in this screenshot here. So on the left-hand side here, we have controls. So each of these here is a control. And what the user will be able to do is they will be able to drag and drop this control over to the right-hand side. So this section here, we're just going to call it the diagram. So once the control has been dragged and dropped to the diagram section, the user will be able to connect those controls together. So the library that we're going to be using to come up with this user interface, well, the main library that we're going to be using is something called jsPlumb. And jsPlumb is a JavaScript library that helps us to connect two HTML elements graphically. So there are two editions, the Toolkit edition, which is the commercial edition, and there is also a community edition, which is open source. So we're going to be using the community edition. Now in jsPlumb, just to go through some jsPlumb terminology, in jsPlumb, this line here is called a connection, okay? And the connection originates from an endpoint, right? So what you see here, this dot here is called an endpoint, right? So the way that two HTML elements can be connectable to each other is through endpoints. The connection originates at an endpoint and it terminates at an endpoint as well. Okay, so that's just an overview of the basic terminology that we need to understand jsPlumb. Now, it's also important to understand that these controls here, they're just HTML elements. So this here is just a div. This here is just a div. Okay, that's enough theory. Let's look at the HTML file that we're going to be using for this project. So here's the HTML boilerplate. I've already included Bootstrap, jQuery, jsPlumb, of course, and jQuery UI. I've also created two divs, one div for the toolbox and another div for the diagram. So let's have a look at it right now. So this is the HTML file with just the boilerplate. So here is the toolbox div and here's the diagram div. So let's create two controls inside the diagram div so that we can start playing around with jsPlumb. So let's add some basic styling for these controls. Okay, so also within the diagram div, we want the controls to be positioned with absolute positioning. So we're going to add that CSS rule as well. Okay, so we've gotten the CSS style. So now let's add the divs for the controls. So let's add two controls. So the way we do that is we just do div id is equal to control1, and we give it a class control, and we give it a style. So because we're using absolute positioning, we need to give it some coordinates. So let's do left 50px, top 50px, and let's call this control1. And let's create another control, control2, and let's give it the coordinates 300px, and let's give it 200px. Okay, so let's refresh the web page and we have two controls. Sorry, I forgot to put the code in here, and let's refresh. Okay, so we have two controls. So now that we have the controls, we can start playing around with jsPlumb. So let's first initialize jsPlumb. Okay, so what I've done here is I've initialized the jsPlumb object and I've defined that the container is the diagram div. Before we can do anything to jsPlumb, we have to actually wait for the DOM to initialize. So the way we do that is by binding to the ready event. So instance.bind ready function. Okay. So now that we have jsPlumb initialized, we can start creating the endpoints. So if you remember earlier, for there to be connections between the HTML elements, we need to have endpoints in both of those HTML elements. So earlier, if you look at the screenshot that I showed you, we used these circle as endpoints, right? So let's create these endpoints in our example. Okay, so the type of endpoint that we're going to use is a dot, but they also support rectangle and blank as well as image. Okay. We also have to define the anchor for the endpoint. So the anchor tells jsPlumb where we want the endpoint to be. So for control 1, we want the endpoint to be on the right hand side. So we're going to use the anchor right middle. Now, an endpoint can either be a source of a connection or a target of a connection, and it can be both as well. So in this case, let's make this particular endpoint a source endpoint. So that means that connections can originate from this control. Okay, so let's refresh the HTML page and see what happens. Oh, sorry, I spelled this incorrectly. It should be dot. Okay, so now we have the endpoint, and you see that we can actually start a connection from that endpoint. All right, but it has nothing to connect to, right? So let's add an endpoint to control 2 so that we can connect this this line to it. So let's place the target endpoint on the left-hand side of control 2. So let's use the anchor left middle. And this would be the target endpoint because we want the connection to terminate on this endpoint. So let's refresh that, and there. So now we're able to make a connection between control 1 and control 2. Okay. So now let's make it such that we can drag control 1 and control 2 wherever we want. So let's do control instance dot draggable control 1 and instance dot draggable control 2. Okay, so let's refresh that. Okay, now we're able to drag control 1 and control 2. But there's a small problem in that we can actually drag this outside of the diagram div. So we just need to add a parameter here to make it such that it can only be dragged within the diagram div. Okay, so let's refresh that. And now it can only drag within the diagram div. Okay. So let's also add some styling for this connection, because now it looks a little bit it looks a little ugly. So let's make this line here red, and whenever the mouse hovers above that line, let's make the line a little bit thicker. Okay, so the way we do this is that we create a connection type. So let's do instance dot register connection type, and the name of the connection type would be red connection. And what we want to do is we want to style, we want the line to be red, and we want it to be have a thickness of 5 pixels. And when it is hovered over, we want it to have a slightly different style, where we want it to have a thickness of 10 pixels. Okay, so I misspelled that function. It should be register connection types. And there. Okay, so once we've registered the connection type, when we create the endpoint, we need to specify the connection point, the connection type of the endpoint. So we do connection type, and we specify red connection, and we do that for this as well. So let's refresh. So now when we create the line, it's red, and when we hover over the line, it gets a little bit thicker. Okay, so there's a small problem here in that you see that the endpoint, the line is above the endpoint. So we can correct for this by copying some CSS that is inside the jsPlumb documentation. So let's just copy the CSS from the jsPlumb documentation, and it will correct this. Okay, so now when we drag and drop, when we create the line is below the endpoint. Okay, so now let's add the ability to delete connections as well as controls. So we're going to make it such that when they right click on the connection, there'll be a context menu, and from the context menu, they'll be able to click a button which allows them to delete the node, delete the connection. So I found this. So I'm using this Stack Overflow example on how to create a context menu. So let's copy and paste the CSS for the context menu, and let's create the event handler for this. So in order to detect the right click on a connection, we need to use a context menu event. So we're going to bind to the context menu event, and we're going to create our event handler. Okay, when you use jsPlumb, when you get the context menu event, that context menu event can either refer to somebody right-clicking on the line or somebody right-clicking on the endpoint. So we need to detect what it is in this case. Okay. So we want to only detect when they're right-clicking on the connection. So we're just going to check for whether the item, the component being right-clicked on, has this CSS selector, JTK connector. So let's do that. If component has class JTK endpoint, then let's do this, and we do let's just do this. Okay, so we're just going to save we're just going to save the connection that the user clicked on to the window object, so that when the delete button is pressed, we know which connection needs to be deleted. And then I'm just going to copy this from the Stack Overflow page, which is the code to start, the code to show the context menu. Okay. All right, so let's see what happens now. And when we right click, nope, that did not work. What's the mistake? Oh, sorry, this should be JTK connector. And let's refresh this. And when we right click, yeah, so we have that button. Okay, so now let's implement the event handler for this button. So to delete a connection, we just use the delete connection function, and then we specify the component of that connection. So now when we refresh and we create the connection and we right click, then the connection's gone. So what is the mistake that I made here? Oh, collection should be connection. Okay, let's refresh that and do this. There. But as you can see, after we press the button, the context menu is still visible. So what I'm going to do is, when there are any clicks inside the document, I want to remove any context menus that might exist. So div.custom-menu dot. So let's see whether that works now. Okay, now that works. I just want to add, and also I'm just going to add a link to that Stack Overflow answer just to give some credit to the person who created that. Okay, so now let's also make the controls here deletable. So let's do the same thing. Let's create a context menu when the control is right clicked. So it's the same thing, body dot on context menu. And in this case, we want to only detect controls inside the diagram, right? And when this happens, we'll just use the same code here. And in this case, window.selected control is equal to this DRID. Okay. And when that button is clicked on, so in this case, so this should not be delete connection, this should be delete control. And let's call this delete control. And when that button is clicked on, let's remove the HTML element. Okay, so to remove because when we remove the control, we also want to remove any connections. So we shouldn't use the jQuery function for this. We should instead use the jsPlumb function for this. Okay, so let's refresh this and let's try to right click on this. Oh, okay, I forgot to put event prevent default. So event.prevent default. So let's right click on this and delete control, and it's gone. So when we have the connection and we delete the control, the connection will be deleted as well. Okay, so now let's start working on the toolbox, because at the moment the user is not able to create controls on demand, right? So in order for them to do that, we need to add controls to the toolbox and then make those controls draggable to the diagram div, right? So let's add some controls to the toolbox. Okay, let's refresh that. Okay, and let's style this a little bit because they're too close together here. Let's add some styling for that. Okay, now they look a little bit better. And let's make let's make these controls here in the toolbox draggable. So the way we do this is we use jQuery UI, and that's done using the draggable function. So we do toolbox.control, and we want to make it draggable, and we specify helper clone, and we limit it to within the body. And the destination that we want the control to go to, to be dropped to, is the diagram, right? So we do append to diagram. Okay, now let's see what happens here. So now we can drag this, but we cannot drop it yet. So we're able to drag it, but we cannot drop it yet. So the reason is because we haven't made the diagram div a droppable area. So let's now make the diagram div a droppable area. Okay, so before that, each control here needs to have a unique ID, right? So I'm just going to copy and paste some code from Stack Overflow for generating a UUID. So let's add that function. Okay. So whenever we drag and drop something from the toolbox to the diagram div, we will generate a UUID and we'll assign that UUID as the ID of that div. And let's now make that the diagram div droppable. So let's do diagram and let's make this droppable. And when there is a drop event, let's create a control. Okay, let's see what happens now. Yeah, so now it's dropped into the diagram div. but it's not draggable, right? So let's make it draggable. Okay, so now when we drag it, then when we dropped it, it's draggable. Okay, so but then there are no endpoints, so let's create an endpoint on both sides here. Okay, so now when we drag, we also create, jsPlumb will create an endpoint on both sides of that control. Okay, so this would be the source, this would be the target. So if you do not like this, we do not like this type of connector style, you can also change that. So jsPlumb supports a few connection types. So I think this is called the Bezier. It also supports straight, flowchart, and state machine. So let's try changing this connector style to flowchart. So the way you do that is when you register the connections type, you specify the connector. So that's pretty much what I wanted to show you for this video. In future videos, I'll build on this example so that we can build a fully working, simple workflow engine that you can integrate with your own apps.